So let's talk about the difference between weird and non-weird populations, the acronym WEIRD. Can you explain what this means and why it's interesting?
Sure. So that's an acronym that my colleagues Steve Heine and Ara Noren-Zion and I coined in 2010. And it stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. And we coined it when we were making a critique of the experimental behavioral sciences, including psychology in particular. And what we had done is, well, first we noticed that most studies in psychology and allied disciplines were done with American subjects or university students in Europe, not sampling very broadly across the species. And then those results were often taken to be representative and written up as if people do this or people think this particular way. So we surveyed the available evidence and found that not only was there substantial more variation, psychologically speaking, than you would have gotten from reading psychology textbooks or even leading journals, but that the populations most commonly studied by psychologists and other researchers were often at the extreme ends of the distribution. So they were weird, so they were psychologically unusual. So as a way of raising researchers' consciousness about this methodological problem, we call these populations the WEIRD and use the acronym.
Yeah. Can you talk about why, in what ways weird people differ from non-weird? And probably the vast majority of listeners to this podcast would fall in the weird category, right?
Yep. So one thing that's probably the best studied dimension for this is individualistic. So very focused on themselves, trying to cultivate individual attributes or dispositions, concerned with their own accomplishments, overconfident, tending to think of themselves as a unitary self, lots of experiences of guilt relative to shame. And then potentially related to this, but potentially independent, is a tendency to think more analytically versus holistically. So analytic thinkers tend to break things down into its parts, assign property to those parts, and use that to explain the behavior of things. People who think holistically look at the relationships between things and the background context to explain things. So if you think about physics, physicists break things down to little itty-bitty particles and then assign properties to those particles. And then when that breaks down, they go to even smaller particles and they assign properties to those particles. What psychologists do is they assign personalities to people. These are, dispositional traits to individuals. Economists assign preferences. So those are analytic thinking. If you were to do that from a kind of holistic point of view, you think about the relationships between people and not focus on the dispositions. There's also a tendency to use intentionality or other mental states in making moral judgments. So if somebody steals something, if you're weird, you tend to be concerned about, well, did they mean to steal it or did they take it by accident? Same thing with something like murder. Intentionality plays a big role. But in the studies I present in The Weirdest People in the World and have done work with Cami Curtin and others, we find that actually there's quite a bit of variation, Clark Barrett, quite a bit of variation in people's tendency to use intentionality or other mental states in judging others. So those are just three examples. Another would be cooperation with strangers, seems to vary a lot.
Yeah. I think the you glossed over it, but the difference between guilt and shame, I think, should dwell on a little bit. By guilt, you mean, can you talk about what you mean by the difference between those and how why weird people might feel one?
I think one of the traits of being weird is kind of getting all guilt and shame kind of confused. So shame is that emotion you experience, seems to be a human universal, when you violate a shared norm. So you've fallen in the eyes of the community, in the eyes of others, in the eyes of people you respect because of this violation of the norm. Shame in many societies is also contagious. So if someone close to you in your social network, say your son or your brother, violates a social norm, you actually get shame. You experience shame because of what they did, and people will also think badly of you because of what your brother did in lots of places. So anthropologists and others have long talked about shame society. So social life is governed by shame. Guilt is different. It doesn't seem to have the kind of body signals that you have with shame, which is this low kind of head down, make yourself small look, that we actually see kind of the predecessors of this in non-human primates. with guilt, it's your personal standard. So it's not a social thing. So you might have a personal standard that you go to the gym every day. Your neighbor is not going to judge you if you skip the gym and take a nap on a particular day, but you might feel guilt about not going to the gym because you've set a personal standard and you're aspiring to that standard. And the idea is that guilt is an important emotion or affective state that helps you pursue your own goals. And it's very much a personal thing. Now, of course, your own goals are going to be influenced by the demands of your society, but it's not the sense that everyone's judging you. It's much more about you judging you.
Yeah, so weird people are much more likely to live in a culture of guilt than a culture that really values shame. And I think I can definitely see this in America, right? You're not really supposed to, shame is really like an illusion.
So shame societies tend to have a lot more norms to violate. And so you're more likely to break them. You're more cautious in that sense. More individualistic societies tend to get rid of a lot of extra norms. And so there's fewer norms to break, and it's more about, individual aspirations and failures to achieve those.
And there's one really interesting experiment where you ask people just to complete the sentence, I am blank.
Right. Yeah, so this is widely used by social psychologists to get at the concept of...
And maybe actually before you describe it, I just want to invite my listeners to, if you have to complete the sentence, I am blank, without just saying your name, giving something about who you are, what's the first thing that occurs to you? Just think about it, and now you can describe the experiment.
Okay. So you have to answer this in 20 different ways, and then psychologists will code the different ways that people answer. And so I say in the book, I might answer by saying I am curious, I am a kayaker, I'm a scientist. And so all of those tell you things about me and what I care about. But I didn't answer it by saying, I'm Jessica's father, and various other relationships, Ross's brother. And because those would tell you more about my relationships and less about my aspirations and accomplishments and things like that. So when you go around the world and you code how people in different societies ask this, you range from American undergraduates who give you almost all, or sometimes all, things like I am curious, I am a fast runner, things like that, as opposed to the relationships, what sort of core groups you're in, things about your family and whatnot. And so this just varies a lot across societies.
And this also varies a lot within countries. I think most people would recognize the American South to be historically more a place where you might identify yourself by what family you belong to, at least relative to the Northeast, for instance. And I imagine on many of these dimensions, you're going to find big variation just within a single country.
Yeah, that's for sure. And that's one of the things I really emphasize in the book. So in various chapters, I look at variation within China, just looking at different provinces, variation with India. And I have a big section devoted to variation just within European countries, including just within Italy. My lab is actually now working on a kind of US-focused project where we're able to quantify some of these differences across US counties. And so we can compare counties and look at the history of those counties and look at things like whether they're more morally universalistic or more morally parochial, just comparing Americans with Americans. And you see lots of interesting patterns of variation.